Ladies and gentlemen, I have a question for you. When was the last time that you thought about our Arctic, other than when Rob mentioned it a few seconds ago? Seriously, I wouldn't be surprised if right now was the first time in quite a while. I bet you envisioned a barren, frozen wasteland, remote and inaccessible, its few inhabitants struggling to eke out a living. And you're not alone. This is the image that most Canadians share, an image that has really driven our policy of indifference toward a seemingly unimportant and uninteresting area of our country. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's time that this image was shattered. Our future security and economic prosperity depend on it, far more than most Canadians suspect. Now, today, Canada's Arctic really presents us with both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity is that it's now quite possibly one of the most valuable areas on Canadian soil. It contains 25% of the world's remaining oil and natural gas, now accessible because of melting snow and ice. The Northwest Passage, once reserved for daring explorers and adventurers, is now poised to become the next major international waterway, with trips 2 weeks shorter than those through the Panama Canal. Far from being just an uninteresting backwater, the Arctic can propel the Canadian economy several places up the world rankings. But there's a problem. We're not the only ones who are interested. Russia, Denmark, and the United States all want to share in what will shortly become one of the largest resource grabs in history. And when pitted against these new competitors, Canada is simply not ready to defend its stake. We must take action now if we're to defend our national sovereignty and protect the Arctic through solutions that I'll be discussing later in this talk. Now, it's true that the Arctic wasn't always such a valuable opportunity. People have been dreaming of traveling through the Northwest Passage ever since Roald Amundsen first discovered a safe route through at the turn of the 20th century. We've known since the 60s that there are plentiful amounts of oil and natural gas in the region, but no one ever considered commercial development because at the time it was simply unfeasible. Arctic waterways were only open for a few weeks a year, and bad weather made work extremely difficult, even dangerous. Oil companies decided it would be easier and cheaper to invest in other areas, like the Gulf of Mexico. But times have changed. It's not the 1960s anymore. Climate change is causing the polar ice caps to melt at an incredible rate. In fact, in the summer of 2007, the Northwest Passage was completely ice-free and safely navigable, something that was only supposed to happen in 2080. As a result, the Arctic is now far more accessible than it ever was 50 years ago. There's also the rising cost of oil. How many of you remember when prices at the pump were 40 cents a liter? Now what are they, $1.20, $1.30? Because of the spike in demand, it's now profitable to develop areas that were previously rejected as being too expensive, like the Canadian Arctic. But I mean, don't just take my word for it. Look at what market forces are doing right now. Oil companies are now funding extensive research into the prime places for drilling in the Arctic, and the Canadian government is under serious pressure to hand out licenses for exploration. In fact, just recently, British Petroleum paid $1.2 billion just for the right to explore the Arctic, not even to develop it. Commercial ships like cargo transports and even cruise liners are now being sent through the Northwest Passage. In fact, again, in the summer of 2007, more than 50 vessels were sent through with no issues whatsoever. And that number is only going to increase as time goes on. With a little bit of luck, Canada could become one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas in the world and the next major hub for world trade. There are billions of dollars to be made here, and the Canadian economy can only benefit as a result. If you weren't sure of it before, be sure of it now. The Canadian Arctic is worth our attention. But there's a problem. Other countries don't recognize our sovereignty over the area and are trying to take it for themselves. For instance, while we consider the Northwest Passage to be Canadian internal waters, other countries see it as an international strait and send ships through without even asking or even informing Canadian officials first. Another example is Hans Island, located between Greenland and Canada. The Danish have recently stepped up their claims to what we consider to be Canadian territory, sending ships there and even planting a Danish flag. But the most dangerous threat of all came from the Russians in 2007, when they used a nuclear submarine to plant a flag on the North Pole, claiming it as their own in violation of international law. Now, this wouldn't be such a problem if Canada actually had the ability to respond to these threats to our national sovereignty. But unfortunately, compared to the Russians or the Americans, we're extremely weak. Take, for example, the Russian Arctic Fleet, which is composed of 30 nuclear submarines and 7 nuclear icebreakers. The Canadian Navy, on the other hand, has no submarines and only one ship that can actually break winter Arctic ice. And let's face it, the Arctic is covered in ice for most of the year. The Canadian Army only has around 4,000 Canadian Rangers stationed in the Arctic. That's a group of part-time soldiers that really don't have the equipment, training, or resources to sufficiently defend the sheer vastness of the Arctic. While the Canadian Air Force does have an Arctic surveillance fleet, it's based in Nova Scotia and British Columbia, and it takes 10 to 12 hours for the planes to even reach the Arctic. What's more, they're so old that in 2007, half of all regularly scheduled patrols were cancelled because the aircraft broke down and had to be repaired. This lack of control over our own territory is stunning. It's no wonder why that Pierre LeBlanc, the former commander of Canada's Arctic forces, stated that, quote, presently our ability to know what's going on in our own backyard is just about zero. Now, we've talked a lot about the problem, but what's the solution? Well, it's clear that we need to expand our military. Having a strong military is necessary for us to have any clout when it comes to maintaining our national sovereignty. Now, our current Conservative government has pledged to increase our Arctic defenses, but unfortunately, thus far, it's been mostly rhetoric. For instance, Mr. Harper originally promised us 3 nuclear icebreakers, but our government's most recent Navy shipbuilding contract only contains 1 ship that can actually break winter Arctic ice. But ladies and gentlemen, we need these icebreakers. We need modern planes, ships, and submarines, not just 30-year-old hand-me-downs from the British. We need ports and military bases in the Arctic so that we can quickly respond to any threat or emergency. Having a strong military will not only help us protect our national sovereignty, but it'll also give us greater standing on the international stage, allowing us to play a greater role in decision-making and to promote our own values and interests. But the truth is that building up the military isn't the only thing that we need to do to protect the Arctic. We also need a Canadian presence in the Arctic, something that'll make it impossible for anyone to doubt that we have a truly valid claim to the region. We need to revive the pioneer spirit and settle our own land. Now, I know some of you may be skeptical. The Arctic is a very foreboding landscape, and it will be difficult to convince people to move there. But you may be forgetting that we've done this once before in the 1870s when we colonized the prairies. The situation that the earliest pioneers faced then is very similar to what we're facing now. The area was threatened by foreign expansion. It was dangerous. It was unexplored. There was plenty of extreme weather and very little infrastructure. But driven by opportunity and the right incentives, people came to create a new life there. We can do the same thing in the Arctic, except with oil wells instead of farms. Workers, as they move to the Arctic, will bring their families, developing small communities. Small businesses will spring up, developing service economies that will accelerate growth. If the Canadian government actively advertises the opportunities of the Arctic and helps build and subsidize the necessary infrastructure, we will succeed. And once Canadians truly live and thrive in the Arctic, nobody else can doubt our claim to the region. It will be truly ours. Ladies and gentlemen, the Arctic is worth protecting. It holds the key to our future security and to our economic prosperity. It is ours to protect, to develop, and to live in. To quote our own national anthem, we must keep our true north strong and free.